Chapter 6. Gilderoy Lockhart. Compared to the night before, staying up and laughing with her friends, the next day started going downhill at a fairly steep rate for Violet. The 4 long house tables were laden with tureens of porridge, plates of kippers, mountains of toast, and dishes of eggs and bacon, beneath the enchanted ceiling, today a dull, cloudy grey. Violet and Tracy found Cassius already at the Slytherin table and plopped down on either side of him and began filling their plates at once. Draco Malfoy was also already seated. Several seats down on the opposite side of the table, Violet could hear snippets of his loud whispering to his friends, Crabbe and Goyle, but was determined not to hear any of it. "Mail ought to be here soon," Tracy said, licking the excess marmalade off a spoon. "I hope Papa remembered to send me my trainers. I forgot them when I was packing." Violet had only just started her porridge when, sure enough, there was a rushing sound overhead, and 100 or so owls streamed in, circling the hall and dropping letters and packages into the chattering crowd. Tracy let out a noise of delight as a lumpy package was dropped into her lap, but Violet's attention was drawn to a familiar, struggling mass of grey feathers flapping its way toward the Gryffindor table. A moment later it dropped from the air and landed squarely in a milk jug. "That poor thing," Violet muttered. Errol was the Weasley's owl, and he was old and feeble and prone to collapse at the end of even the shortest flights. She watched Ron pull him from the milk jug, and across the table saw Neville Longbottom's face go white as a sheet. "Something's wrong," she said, just starting to get to her feet when Ronald Weasley. A roar of sound filled the huge hall, shaking dust from the ceiling. "Stealing the car. I wouldn't have been surprised if they'd expelled you. You wait till I get hold of you. I don't suppose you stopped to think what your father and I went through when we saw it was gone, Mrs." Weasley's yells, 100 times louder than usual, made the plates and spoons rattle on even the Slytherin table and echoed deafeningly off the stone walls. People throughout the hall were swiveling around to see what the source of the awful noise was, and Ron sank so low in his chair that only his crimson forehead could be seen. "Letter from Dumbledore last night. I thought your father would die of shame. We didn't bring you up to behave like this. You and the twins could have died." Violet sat down immediately. "Absolutely disgusted your father's facing an inquiry at work, and it's entirely your fault. And if you put another toe out of line, we'll bring you straight back home." A ringing silence fell. It was broken moments later by the sound of laughter, and gradually a babble of talk broke out again. Violet looked around at Tracy, shock written all over both of their faces. "What was that?" Tracy asked, uncovering her ears. "Howler," said Cassius as he sipped his pumpkin juice. "You've never gotten one before. Muggles don't have those," Violet told him, which earned a bewildered shrug. It was a good thing the Dursleys never showed any interest in magical communication. She could only imagine the sort of horrible mail she and Harry would get if Uncle Vernon knew that he could still shout at them from halfway across the country. But she had no time to dwell on this. Professor Snape was moving along the Slytherin table, handing out course schedules. Violet took hers and saw that they had double charms with the Ravenclaws first. Violet and Tracy waved goodbye to Cassius, who was on his way to his 4th-year care of magical creatures class out on the grounds, and made for the 3rd floor. They arrived early, and as Violet was making her way to her seat, she was stopped by a high, familiar voice calling, "Here, please, Potter." Professor Flitwick, a tiny little wizard who had to stand on a pile of books to see while teaching class, was waving her over to his desk. Violet handed her things off to Tracy and nervously made her way to the front of the classroom. "Yes, Professor," she said. Flitwick was at eye level with her for once, already standing on his books. He took a moment to rummage through some papers on his desk, and Violet's heart sank as he produced short, printed, formal-looking notice with her name on it. "I wanted a word with you before class started, Miss Potter," Professor Flitwick said, looking at her sternly over the rims of his rounded glasses. "Now, I have an acquaintance in the improper use of magic office who is kind enough to inform me when students of mine receive reprimands for use of certain kinds of magic. Oh, dear, there's no need to upset. You aren't in trouble. Violet was blinking rapidly to try and stop the tears from building in her eyes, but evidently it wasn't working. Professor Flitwick produced a handkerchief from thin air and quickly handed it to her. Well, I should say you are a little bit in trouble, but not with me, said Professor Flitwick. No, I wanted to speak to you, Potter, about, well, how shall I put this? He tossed the slip of paper back into the pile on his desk, thinking. As Violet was dabbing at her eyes with the handkerchief, he said, You have something of knack for spell work. I noticed it right away from the moment you stepped into my class, and I believe that you have the potential to greatly excel charms. This incident over the summer hover charms are more complicated than most give them credit for, and I must say I was delighted to hear that you had achieved such a spell outside of the classroom, though you shouldn't have done that. I'm afraid I really must stress it is against the rules. It's not what you think, sir, Violet said quickly. The hover charm wasn't. Said Professor Flitwick, shushing her with a waggle of his finger. I don't need to know the details, Potter, and in fact, I believe it best that I don't know anything about it, eh? Now, as your teacher, it is my duty to caution you against further infractions of magical laws and steer you away from such unruly behavior. However, Professor Flitwick leaned in slightly, his eyes twinkling behind his round spectacles. As your teacher, it is also my duty to encourage you to pursue your passions and to notice when a student is not benefiting from the limits of the standard curriculum. You are on good terms with Mr. Warrington, I understand. Another fine student and a good lad, from what I've seen in my classes. I advise you to ask him to mentor you, Miss Potter. With any luck, the guidance from an older student will keep you from becoming restless in your lessons, and I believe Mr. Warrington could benefit from some of your patience as well. Think on it, won't you? And should you ever need a place to show off what you've learned, Potter, my office is open most days after lunch and before dinner. Off you go now. With a conspiratorial little wink, Professor Flitwick waved Violet, feeling rather dazed, back to her seat. The rest of the class had started to trickle in, groups of students chattering amongst each and filling the room with a low, excited buzz. Tracy was on the edge of her seat with anxiety by the time Violet sat down beside her. Are you in trouble? She asked quietly, her brows knit in concern. When Violet shook her head, her expression immediately brightened. Oh, good. What did Flitwick want then? He wants me to be careful with my magic, Violet said, but he also told me to talk to Cassius about being my mentor. Cassius. He's good with charms too, apparently. Do you think I should ask him after class? Tracy nodded emphatically. Absolutely. Even if he says no, you can tell him what Flitwick said about him. He likes hearing nice things about himself. Don't most people, Violet said with a grin, but their conversation was cut short by Professor Flitwick calling for quiet, and the start of the year's very first lesson began. Flitwick's classes always started with a practical demonstration. For the next few weeks they would be focusing on scouring charms. He informed them brightly, before pulling the lid off a large barrel beside his desk and tipping its contents onto the floor. A thick, green, foul-smelling sludge splashed all down the center aisle, prompting screams and retching sounds from those in the front rows. Students were starting to climb onto their desks and chairs when Professor Flitwick shouted a few short words, swept his wand back and forth, and removed both the muck and the smell in a matter of moments. There was a lot of clapping at this display, and then a lot of groaning as they were instructed to open their books and begin reading through the chapters pertaining to scouring charms and their history. It would be another week at least before any of them were to practice casting it themselves. After charms, Violet and Tracy headed down to the first floor for their history of magic lesson with the ghostly Professor Binns, who had fallen asleep one day in the staff room and gotten up to teach the next morning, leaving his body behind. Professor Binns launched into a dull lecture the moment they were all seated. Violet hastily started taking notes. She'd learned last year that no matter how monotonous Bin's voice could be, he would usually talk about some pretty interesting stuff. He was half an hour into a speech about the foundation of various medieval wizarding societies when a murmur started rippling out from the opposite side of the classroom. "Did you see that?" Millicent Bulstrode whispered loudly, prompting Violet to look up from her notes. Several students were already standing up out of their seats, looking toward the windows. Violet craned her neck to see over Goyle's hulking shoulders. Sheets of paper were floating past outside the classroom windows, as though they'd fallen from a great height, and Violet had just nudged Tracy's arm to direct her attention when something much larger and heavier went flying past, with which a subcommittee of Sardinian sorcerers was involved in September of that year. Professor Binns droned on, oblivious to the fact that his entire class had left their seats and crossed the room, fogging up the windows with their noses pressed to the cold glass. Books had joined the papers now, and a full book bag went sailing past and scattered its contents on the lawns below. Ink pots, chairs, an awful lot of Lockhart books. Even a wan came spinning from above and stuck point first into the dewy grass. They spent the rest of class there by the windows, watching as what looked like half a classroom was dashed on the ground outside, not hearing a word of what Professor Binns was saying. It wasn't until next period, after marching up to the defense against the dark arts classroom, only to find it closed with a note reading, "Lessons cancelled for today," in very fancy handwriting pinned to the door, that they all found out what had happened. "He's mental," Ron said loudly, when Violet cornered him and Harry at lunchtime. "First he gave us this test, right at the start of all, but all the questions were about the man and his hair and his birthday and his favorite color. Then with no warning he pulls out this cage of pixies, right? He just opened it and set the bloody things on us. He was, of course, Professor Gilderoy Lockhart, who Violet was beginning to suspect had very little to no actual teaching qualifications whatsoever. It washes wand that had been tossed from the window above and landed outside the history of magic classroom. It had taken Professors Flitwick and McGonagall the better part of the afternoon to round up all of the Cornish pixies that had escaped the classroom and begun running rampant throughout the school. They would have had an easier time of it, if not for Peeves' involvement. "I'm telling you, he's an idiot," Ron grumbled through a mouthful of soggy bread roll. "No idea what Dumbledore was thinking, hiring someone like him." Violet got her own taste of Lockhart's idiocy the very next day. As their lesson was postponed the day before, the Slytherins were to have a make-up lesson during one of their usual free periods, and all filed into the defense against the dark arts classroom that afternoon. The room itself had been mostly restored. Some paintings were still hanging crooked on the walls, and students in the back row had to watch for pieces of glass on the floors. Violet and Tracy found seats together off to the side of the room. When the whole class was seated, Professor Lockhart cleared his throat loudly and silence fell. He reached forward, picked up Theodore Nart's copy of Travels with Trolls, and held it up to show his own, winking portrait on the front. "Me," he said, pointing at it and winking as well. "Gilderoy Lockhart, Order of Merlin, 3rd class, honorary member of the Dark Force Defense League, and 5-time winner of Which Weekly's Most Charming Smile Award, but I don't talk about that. I didn't get rid of the band and banshee by smiling at her." He waited for them to laugh. A few people smiled weakly. "I see you've all bought a complete set of my books. Well done. As with all of my other classes, I thought we'd start today with a little quiz. Nothing to worry about, just to check how well you've read them, how much you've taken in, hopefully more than some of your classmates." When he had handed out the test papers, he returned to the front of the class and said, "You have 30 minutes start now." Violet looked down at her paper and read. It was exactly as bad as they had been warned by the other houses. On and on it went, over 3 sides of paper, right down to. Violet hated herself for knowing the answer to most of these questions. She had read all of the Lockhart's books. They were required reading after all. but she resented the fact that absolutely nothing was related to the subject of defense against the dark arts. Half an hour later, Lockhart collected the papers and rifled through them in front of the class. Tut, tut, hardly any of you remembered that my favorite color is lilac. I say so in year with the Yeti. And a few of you need to read Wandering with Werewolves more carefully. I clearly state in Chapter 12 that my ideal birthday gift would be harmony between all magic and non-magical peoples, though I wouldn't say no to a large bottle of Ogden's old fire whiskey. He gave them another roguish wink. Tracy was now staring at Lockhart with an expression of disbelief. Draco Malfoy and his friends, Crabbe and Goyle, who were sitting in the back of the room, were doing a poor job of containing their laughter. Pansy Parkinson, on the other hand, was listening to Lockhart with rapt attention, chin resting delicately on her hands as she leaned toward the front of the class. But Miss Violet Potter knew my secret ambition is to rid the world of evil, Lockhart said loudly, and Violet gave a start as he mentioned her name. And market my own range of hair care potions, good girl. In fact, he flipped her paper over full marks. Where is Miss Violet Potter? Violet immediately shrank down in her seat, which did nothing to stop Lockhart's bright blues from landing on her, and his face to spread into a gleaming, white-toothed smile. There you are. Don't know how I could have missed you, dear. We've met before, of course. Excellent, quite excellent. Take 10 points for Slytherin. And now the lesson. He pulled another book off of Nart's desk and waggled it over his head. Everyone, refer to your copies off break with a banshee, please. As my practical lessons have thus far proved too much for my students, tut, what haste this school been teaching you before I came along. So today we will be doing some much-needed revision work. You there, what's your name, dear? P. Parkinson, Pansy stammered as Lockhart pointed abruptly to her. P. Pansy Parkinson, sir. Pansy, how lovely. We've got Pansy and Violet. Are there any more little flowers hiding in the class? Violet had already shrunk so far down in her seat that to go any lower would put her on the floor. Malfoy wasn't even trying to cover his laughter anymore. Lockhart either didn't hear him or thought that Malfoy found him as charming as he found himself. Now, Miss Parkinson, is everyone open to Chapter 1? There is a rather excellent foreword written by Madame Abjura Cramshaw, a dear old friend of mine. However, I think we can skip on over that without missing much. Right then, Pansy, why don't you go ahead and read the first line for us? The rest of the lesson was spent going around the class, each of them being forced in turn to read aloud from Lockhart's books and take notes as they listened. Lockhart was not impressed with their monotonous, unenthusiastic rendition of his narration, constantly chiding them to be more theatrical, more dramatic. No one listened. When it came time for her turn, Violet mumbled and stammered and refused to make eye contact despite Lockhart's increasingly aggressive attempts. They had gotten to the third chapter off break with a banshee bee the time class ended. As no one had bothered to unpack anything besides quills and ink, they all leapt to their seats and made a mad dash for the door. We'll pick up where left off next week, Lockhart called over their retreating heads. Plenty of time to practice adding some flair into it. Chapter 7, Mudbloods and Murmurs. Violet spent a lot of time over the next few days dodging out of sight whenever she saw Gilderoy Lockhart coming down a corridor, which was something she found Harry doing as well. He told Violet how Lockhart had been waiting for him outside the greenhouses and of the new menace in his life, Colin Creevey. Colin was a small, mousy, excitable boy who carried a camera with him everywhere he went and made a point of taking as many photographs of Harry and Violet as he possibly could. As a fellow Gryffindor, it was easier for him to focus on Harry, for which Violet was immensely grateful. She hated having her picture taken. Photos of her never came out quite right. There was always something off about her features, to her eyes, and the very idea of a magical moving portrait of herself was unnerving. Malfoy had become even more insufferable, well, if that were even possible. Fueled by Colin and Lockhart's adoration for the Potter twins, His animosity toward them had grown more and more pronounced. He jeered at Violet when she raised her hand in class, commenting loudly that she didn't need to show off, as there was no one there to take her picture. He made a sport of calling out Harry and Violet's positions to Colin, or addressing them loudly whenever Lockhart was in earshot. In the Slytherin common room, he made such a pest of himself that Violet and Tracy had taken to doing their homework, sprawled out on their 4-poster beds, rather than trying to block out his loud commentary on Violet's every move while trying to work at one of the tables. Crookshanks was still angry with her about the disastrous car journey as well. He come stomping through the dormitory the next day, straight past her astonished welcome, and sequestered himself just out of reach beneath Tracy's bed. Only his furious orange eyes could be seen in the darkness, and all attempts to reach for him were met with increasingly aggressive growls. It was easier to just leave him be. With the whole week starting out so rotten, Violet was very happy to reach the weekend. She and Harry had made arrangements to visit Hagrid on Saturday morning. Violet, however, was rudely awoken several hours earlier than she would have liked by loud, excited voices coming from the common room. "Wassamata," said Tracy groggily, sitting up as Violet climbed out of bed. "Noisy boys," Violet said angrily. She yanked her robes on over her pajamas and pulled open the door, letting in even more of the raucous cheering. She stomped up the short stone staircase, intent on giving the noisemakers a piece of her sleepy, sleepy mind, but stopped short as soon as she reached the top of the steps. There were a lot more people in the common room than she'd expected, and almost all of them were older. Still in their pajamas, a group of large boys were gathered about the entryway, circled around something Violet couldn't see, oohing and eyeing. She padded closer, trying to remain out of sight while craning her neck to see what all the fuss was about. "Potter!" Malfoy's pale face peeked out from between the shoulders of two much bigger boys, grinning nastily. Half a dozen faces turned to look at her, and Violet very nearly darted straight back down the stairs. "Come to join the celebration." "What are we celebrating?" Violet asked carefully, taking a few more steps toward them. Malfoy gave a nod, and the crowd split to reveal what was in their center. Violet gasped. Each boy, who she now realized were all 6 members of the Slytherin Quidditch team, was holding a highly polished, brand-new racing broom. Malfoy was holding one as well, and he posed smugly with it as she approached. On the handle she could make out the fine gold lettering that spelled the words Nimbus 2001. "Impressive, aren't they?" said Malfoy. "The very latest model. These ought to help Slytherin keep our hold on the Quidditch Cup for another 8 years, wouldn't you say?" "Where did they come from?" asked Violet, trying very hard not to be impressed. They were very pretty brooms. The handles were polished with black lacquer, unlike Harry's simple brown broom. Malfoy's smile grew wider and nastier. "My father," he said. "Slytherin was his house as well, you see, and we proper Slytherins like to take care of our own. He's not here to take your thanks directly, but I can pass your gratitude on to him if you like." "I'll keep it, thanks," Violet said through clenched teeth. A chuckle went up around the room. She realized suddenly that everyone had stopped ogling over their brooms and taken to watching them instead. "Yow should thank me, Potter," Malfoy said, the grin vanishing from his pointed face. "It's only polite. And a bit of politeness might be the only thing keeping me from knocking your brother off his broom. I'll bet those glasses of his aren't the only thing that breaks easy." "You don't have any business on a broom, Malfoy," said Violet, cutting through the low chuckles around her. "How long did it take Madam Hooch to correct all your little mistakes again? You'd have some luck finding yourself on the Quidditch pitch after all that." "I suppose it's luck that's on my side, then," Malfoy spat, his eyes blazing, "seeing as I've been recruited to the house team." "Oh, how much that cost your father? Or was it included with the price of the brooms?" Malfoy took an angry step toward her, and when Violet tried to step back, she found her path blocked by the large, leering form of Marcus Flint, the Slytherin team captain. He grinned down at her. "You'd better start showing some gratitude, Potter," Malfoy said, far too close to Violet for her own comfort. Or my new friends and I might be insulted. You don't want to insult us, do you? 6 broad, hulking boys were now gathered in a circle around her and Malfoy, blocking every path that she could take to get away. Violet realized, viscerally and immediately, that she was in danger. Outnumbered and outsized, she had little chance of holding her own if they decided the confrontation needed to come to blows. Her face felt hot, and her heart was racing in her chest as Malfoy took another half-step into her space. "So how about that, thank you? How about leaving her alone, you prat?" Malfoy looked up, and the other boys whirled around at the shout from across the room, and Violet wasted no time in using the opening to dart under Flint's elbow and slip out of his reach. Gemma Farley, former prefect and current head girl, was standing in the doorway of the girls' dormitory, wearing a bright pink bathrobe and a fierce scowl. Her wand was drawn and pointed right at Flint's ugly, troll-like face. "Over here, Potter," she commanded, and Violet scampered behind her at once. "Did they hurt you?" "No. Good. Get back to your dorm and get dressed. I'll have a word with these gents on your behalf." Violet didn't have to be told twice. Without so much as a backward glance at Malfoy's pointed little face, she raced back into her dormitory and slammed the door behind her. Tracy, who was only just in the process of pulling on her slippers, started at the sudden noise. "What was the bang?" "Sorry," Violet said. She flashed a smile to cover the fact that she was shaking all over. Things should be quieter out there now. Perhaps they would have been if that hadn't been the exact moment that Gemma Farley started to shout. Violet had planned to spend the entire rest of the day locked in the safety of the girls' dormitory she would have, if not for Tracy's reminder that Harry's first practice was meant to be that morning. She'd promised him she would be there to see him fly, and knew Harry would be hurt if she didn't show up. She and Tracy dressed quickly and waited for the yelling to quiet down out in the common room before venturing up the stairs and peeking out. The Quidditch team and their broomsticks were gone, leaving only a breathless Gemma and the handful of brave souls that had peeked to see who'd earned the chewing out. Keeping an eye out for unwanted attention, the pair of them hurried outside and made their way across the field to the Quidditch pitch. "Oh no," Violet groaned, drawing up short as they passed through the stands. "I'm too late." Harry and the rest of the Gryffindor Quidditch team, along with Ron and Hermione, were standing out in the middle of the field in their practice robes, facing off against the bulk of the Slytherin Quidditch team with their new brooms and new seeker. The Slytherins were smiling, but none of the Gryffindors looked happy. Tracy looked to Violet uncertainly. "Do you think we should?" Whatever she was about to suggest was cut off by a sudden yell of outage followed by a loud, sharp bang. Violet watched in horror as Ron was sent flying backward and landed heavily in the grass. By the time Violet and Tracy reached him, Malfoy and the Slytherin team were in hysterics. "What happened?" Violet cried. "Who hit him?" "His wand backfired," Harry told her, helping Hermione to heave Ron to his feet. "We've got to get him to Hagrid's. He's closest." Ron interrupted Harry with a loud belch, and Tracy screamed in horror as several slugs dribbled out of his mouth and down his chest. "Gross," she cried, taking several flailing steps away from Ron and the slugs. "Oh my gosh, that is so gross. I'm gonna be sick, Violet, I swear." "Go back inside, then," Violet snapped, following after her brother. He and Hermione supported Ron out of the stadium and across the grounds toward the edge of the forest. "Nearly there, Ron," said Hermione, as the gamekeeper's cabin came into view. "You'll be all right in a minute, almost there." They were within 20 feet of Hagrid's house when the front door opened, but it wasn't Hagrid who emerged. Gilderoy Lockhart, wearing robes of palest mauve today, came striding out. "Quick, behind here," Harry hissed, dragging Ron behind a nearby bush while Violet took hold of Hermione's arm and dragged her as well. "It's a simple matter if you know what you're doing," Lockhart was saying loudly to Hagrid. "If you need help, you know where I am. I'll let you have a copy of my book. I'm surprised you haven't already got one. I'll sign it tonight and send it over. Well, goodbye." And he strode away toward the castle. They waited until Lockhart was out of sight, then pulled Ron out of the bush and up to Hagrid's front door. Harry knocked urgently. Hagrid appeared at once, looking very grumpy, but his expression brightened when he saw who it was. "Been wondering. When you come to see me come in thought you might have been Professor Lockhart back again." Harry and Hermione supported Ron over the threshold into the one-roomed cabin, which had an enormous bed in one corner, a fire crackling merrily in the other. Hagrid didn't seem perturbed by Ron's slug problem, which Harry hastily explained as he lowered Ron into a chair. "Better out than in," he said cheerfully, plunking a large copper basin in front of him. "Get 'em all up, Ron." "I don't think there's anything to do except wait for it to stop," said Hermione anxiously, watching Ron bend over the basin. "That's a difficult curse to work at the best of times, but with a broken wand." Hagrid was bustling around making them tea. His boarhound, Fang, was slobbering over Violet, who had taken the seat farthest from Ron to avoid this very problem. "What did Lockhart want with you, Hagrid?" Harry asked conversationally. "Givin' me advice on getting kelpies out of a well," growled Hagrid, moving a half-plucked rooster off his scrubbed table and setting down the teapot. "Like I darn know. And bangin' on about some banshee he banished. If one word of it was true, I'll eat my kettle." It was most unlike Hagrid to criticize a Hogwarts teacher, and the twins looked at him in surprise. Hermione, however, said in a voice somewhat higher than usual, "I think you're being a bit unfair." Professor Dumbledore obviously thought he was the best man for the job. "He was Theonimin for the job," said Hagrid, offering them a plate of treacle toffee, while Ron coughed squelchily into his basin. "And I mean Theonion. Gettin' very difficult to find anyone for the dark arts job. People aren't too keen to take it on, see? They're startin' to think it's jinxed. No one's lasted for a long while now." "But what about Professor Snape?" Violet said, confused. "Everyone says he's been wanting the job for years. If there's no one else after the position, why doesn't Dumbledore just let him have it?" Hagrid grimaced. "Thar's a question for Professor Dumbledore, Violet. I wouldn't recommend asking Snape about it touchy subject." "So tell me," said Hagrid, jerking his head at Ron, "who was he trying to curse?" "Malfoy called Hermione something," Harry said. "It must have been really bad because everyone went wild." "It was bad," said Ron hoarsely, emerging over the tabletop looking pale and sweaty. "Malfoy called her mudblood." Hagrid Ron dived out of sight again as a fresh wave of slugs made their appearance. Hagrid looked outraged. "He didn't," he growled at Hermione. "He did," she said, "but I don't know what it means." "I could tell it was really rude, of course. It's about the most insulting thing he could think of," gasped Ron, coming back up. "Mudblood's a really foul name for someone who is muggle-born, you know, non-magic parents. There are some wizards like Malfoy's family who think they're better than everyone else because they're what people call pure blood." He gave a small burp, and a single slug fell into his outstretched hand. He threw it into the basin and continued. "I mean, the rest of us know it doesn't make any difference at all. Look at Neville Longbottom, he's pure blood, and he can hardly stand a cauldron the right way up." "And they haven invented a spell our Hermione can do," said Hagrid proudly, making Hermione go a brilliant shade of magenta. "It's a disgusting thing to call someone," said Ron, wiping his sweaty brow with a shaking hand. "Dirty blood, see, common blood. It's ridiculous. Most wizards these days are half-blood anyway. If we hadn't married muggles, we'd have died out." He retched and ducked out of sight again. "Well, I darn blame ye for tryin' to curse him, Ron," said Hagrid loudly, over the thuds of more slugs hitting the basin. "Boo, maybe it was a good thing your wand backfired. 'Spect Lucius Malfoy would have come marching up to school if ye'd cursed his son. Least you're not in trouble." Violet would have pointed out that trouble didn't come much worse than having slugs pouring out of your mouth, but she couldn't. Hagrid's treacle toffee had cemented her jaws together. "You too," said Hagrid abruptly, as though struck by a sudden thought. "Got a bone to pick with ye. I've heard you've been jivin' out signed photos. How come I haven't got one?" We haven't been giving out signed photos, Harry said hotly as Violet shook her head, frantically trying to wrench her teeth apart. If Lockhart's still spreading that around, but then they saw that Hagrid was laughing. I'm only joking, he said, patting Violet genially on the back and finally knocking her mouth open. I knew ye hadn't really. I told Lockhart ye didn't need Tay. You're more famous than him without trying. Bet he didn't like that, said Harry, sharing a grin with Violet. Darn, think he said Hagrid, his eyes twinkling. And then I told him I'd never read one o' his books, and he decided Turgo. Treacle toffee, Ron, he added as Ron reappeared. No thanks, said Ron weakly. Better not risk it. Come and see what I've been growing, said Hagrid as Harry, Violet, and Hermione finished the last of their tea. In the small vegetable patch behind Hagrid's house were a dozen of the largest pumpkins Violet had ever seen. Each was the size of a large boulder. Gettin' on well, aren't they? Said Hagrid happily. For the Halloween feast, she be big enough by then. What have you been feeding them? Said Harry. Hagrid looked over his shoulder to check that they were alone. Well, I've been giving them, a bit o' help. Violet noticed Hagrid's flowery pink umbrella leaning against the back of the cabin. Violet had reason to believe before now that this umbrella was not all it looked. In fact, she had the strong impression that Hagrid's old school wand was concealed inside it. Hagrid wasn't supposed to use magic. He had been expelled from Hogwarts in his 3rd year, but Violet had never found out why any mention on the matter, and Hagrid would clear his throat loudly and become mysteriously deaf until the subject was changed. An engorgement charm, I suppose, said Hermione, halfway through disapproval and amusement. Well, you've done a good job on them. That's what your little sister said Hagrid, nodding at Ron. Met her Zeus yesterday. Hagrid looked sideways at Harry, his beard twitching. Said she was Zeus looking round the grounds, but I reckon she was hopping. She might run into someone else at my house. He winked at Harry. If ye ask me, shouldn't say no ter assigned. Oh, shut up, said Harry. Ron snorted with laughter and the ground was sprayed with slugs. Watch it, Hagrid roared, pulling Ron away from his precious pumpkins. It was nearly lunchtime, and as the twins had bit on treacle toffee since dawn, they were eager to go back to school to eat. They all said goodbye to Hagrid and walked back up to the castle, Ron hiccuping occasionally, but only bringing up 2 very small slugs. They had barely set foot in the cool entrance hall when a voice rang out, There you are, Potter Weasley. Professor McGonagall was walking toward them, looking stern. You 3 will do your detentions this evening. What are we doing, Professor? Said Ron, nervously suppressing a burp. Ya will be polishing the silver in the trophy room with Mr. Filch, said Professor McGonagall. And no magic Weasley elbow grease. Ron gulped. Argus Filch, the caretaker, was loathed by every student in the school. And you, mister. And Miss Potter will be helping Professor Lockhart answer his fan mail, said Professor McGonagall. Oh, and Professor, can't I go to the trophy room too? Said Harry. Can't I? Violet said desperately. I'm really good at polishing things. Certainly not, said Professor McGonagall, raising her eyebrows. Professor Lockhart requested you 2 particularly. 8 o'clock sharp, all of you. The 3 of them slouched into the great hall in states of deepest gloom, parting ways as they went to their separate tables. Both Cassius and Tracy were already seated, and Violet slumped into the space they had saved for her. Before they could bombard her with questions, she launched into an explanation of what all had happened that afternoon. Ron's backfiring wand, Malfoy's slur. Cassius scrunched up his face in a frown. The slugs, Tracy gagged loudly. And finally, the news of her detention. I'd give anything to swap with Ron, Violet said hollowly. I wasn't lying, I really am good polishing things. I've had loads of practice with the Dursleys, but answering Lockhart's fan mail, he'll be a nightmare. Saturday afternoon seemed to melt away, and at what seemed like no time, it was 5 minutes to 8, and the twins were meeting up on the 2nd floor landing, dragging their feet all the way down the corridor to Lockhart's office. The door flew open at once. Lockhart beamed down at them. Ah, there's the scalawags, he said. Come in, children, come in. Shining brightly on the walls by the light of many candles were countless framed photographs of Lockhart. He had even signed a few of them. Another large pile lay on his desk. You can address the envelopes, Lockhart told Harry, and you can seal them, he told Violet. He said these things as though they were huge treats. This first one's to Gladys Gudgeon, bless her, huge fan of mine. The minutes snailed by. Violet and Harry let Lockhart's voice wash over them, occasionally saying, and right, and yeah. Now and then they caught a phrase like, fame's a fickle friend, Harry, or celebrity is as celebrity does, Violet, remember that. The candles burned lower and lower, making the light dance over the many moving faces of Lockhart watching them. Violet moved her aching arm over what felt like the 1,000th envelope, placing a small bead of wax onto the flap and pressing it down with the magical stamp Lockhart had given her. The stamp melted the wax on contact, leaving behind a shiny lilac imprint of a peacock's tail. It must be nearly time to leave, Violet thought miserably. Please let it be nearly time. Beside her, Harry gave a huge jump and shouted, What? I know, said Lockhart. 6 solid months at the top of the bestseller list. Broke all records. No, said Harry frantically. That voice. Sorry, said Lockhart, looking puzzled. What voice? That voice that said, didn't you hear it? Lockhart looked at Violet, who was looking at Harry, and guffawed. What are you talking about, Harry? Perhaps you're getting a little drowsy. Great Scott, look at the time. We've been here nearly 4 hours. I'd never have believed it. The time's flown, hasn't it? Harry didn't answer. He looked as though he was straining to focus, concentrating on some imperceivable thing. Violet placed a hand on his arm in concern, and he jumped again. Are you all right? She asked, as soon as Lockhart had ushered them out the door, telling them they mustn't expect a treat like this every time they got detention. Why, yeah, Harry said, looking dazed. His eyes darted up to catch hers, searching intently. You really didn't hear anything, Violet? I don't think I did, Violet said honestly. What was it saying? Harry shook his head with a grimace and tried to walk away, but Violet grabbed him by the elbow and brought him back around to face her. Harry, she said earnestly, please tell me what you heard. Look at you, you're shaking. Was it something bad? It said it wanted to kill me, Harry blurted. It said, let me rip you, let me tear you, let me kill you. That's what it said. That's what I heard a voice saying in there just now. Harry was looking at the floor, hands clenched into nervous fists as he spoke, but Violet only stared at him, mouth open in shock. The hairs were standing up on the back of her neck. Harry, that's horrible, she said finally. Harry gave a hollow sort of laugh. Isn't it? And I'm the only one who heard it unless Lockhart was lying. But why would he? And I know you're not lying about it, so what does it mean? Why would I have heard something like that? I don't know, said Violet, shaking her head in apology. Maybe Lockhart was right, it is late, Harry. And I know I felt like letting my mind go while we were in there. Maybe try to get some sleep for now, and see if you hear it again later. Yeah, Violet watched Harry go on his way up to Gryffindor Tower before heading down to the Slytherin dungeons. Perhaps it was just Harry's words ringing in her ears, but Violet felt a distinct prickle at the back of her neck as she went down the long, shadowy staircase into the dungeons. The common room was dark by that time of night, and Tracy was fast asleep when Violet slipped into the dormitory. For the first time in a week, Crookshanks was curled up on her pillow. He grunted softly as Violet moved him aside, but snuggled up right beside her again. She was grateful for the warmth and the company even so. She drifted into a nervous, fitful sleep. Chapter 8. The Death Day Party. October arrived, spreading a damp chill over the grounds and into the castle. Madame Pomfrey, the nurse, was kept busy by a sudden spate of colds among the staff and students. Her pepper-up potion worked instantly, thought it left the drinker smoking at the ears for several hours afterward. Ginny Weasley, who had been looking pale, was bullied into taking some by Percy. The steam pouring from under her vivid hair gave the impression that her whole head was on fire. Raindrops the size of bullets thundered on the castle windows for days on end. The lake rose, the flower beds turned into muddy streams, and Hagrid's pumpkins swelled to the size of garden sheds. Students avoided heading outside unless they had to, and the journey down to the greenhouses had become more of a slog than anything else. However, according to Harry, the Gryffindor Quidditch captain was as enthusiastic as ever he had them out for regular training sessions, regardless of the stormy skies and frigid rain. Harry had discouraged Violet from coming to see him practice. Oliver Wood was very paranoid about Slytherins spying on the new tactics they'd been training with, and it didn't seem to matter that she was only there to support Harry. Telling him that she didn't even like Quidditch turned out to be a mistake as well. Violet had been keeping a close eye on her brother, much closer than usual. Aside from worrying he would catch a cold from spending so much time out in the cold, she'd been very concerned about the strange, murderous voice Harry had heard during their late-night detention. If Harry had heard anything more from the voice, he hadn't mentioned it to her. But Violet was nothing if not determined she was a Slytherin, after all. Just because she couldn't watch Harry's Quidditch practice didn't mean she had to miss out on spending time with him. It was after practice that they could gather and talk, which was why the pair of them were to be found, late one stormy Saturday a few afternoons before Halloween, shuffling through the deserted hallways and grumbling about Quidditch. Wood, Harry's team captain, was pushing them to be better and better, no matter how miserable the conditions, and the whole team's morale was low after hearing what sort of speed the Slytherin team's new brooms could reach. Violet hadn't seen them in action. She made herself scarce whenever Marcus Flint showed his ugly face, but she'd overheard plenty of the loud bragging from Malfoy, and the other players got up to in the common room. As the pair of them walked Harry squelching along in his dripping, mudded robes, they came across somebody that, for one, neither of them minding running into. Nearly headless Nick, the ghost of Gryffindor Tower, was staring morosely out of a window, muttering under his breath. "Don't fulfill their requirements. Half an inch, if that." "Hello, Nick," said Harry. "Hello, hello," said nearly headless Nick, starting and looking round. He wore a dashing, plumed hat on his long, curly hair, and a tunic with a ruff, which concealed the fact that his neck was almost completely severed. He was pale as smoke, and Violet could see right through him much the way that she could been through while wearing the mysterious silver ring that had been given to her the Christmas before to the dark sky and torrential rain outside. "You look troubled, young Potters," said Nick, folding a transparent letter as he spoke and tucking it inside his doublet. "So do you," said Violet. "Ah," nearly headless Nick waved an elegant hand, "a matter of no importance. It's not as thought I really wanted to join. Thought I'd apply, but apparently I don't fulfill requirements." In spite of his airy tone, there was a look of great bitterness on his face. "But you would think, wouldn't you," he erupted suddenly, pulling the letter back out of his pocket, "that getting his 45 times in the neck with a blunt axe would qualify you to join the Headless Hunt?" Oh yes," said Harry, giving Violet a sharp look. "I mean, nobody wished more than I do that it had all been quick and clean, and my head had come off properly. I mean, it would have saved me a great deal of pain and ridicule. However, we can only accept huntsmen whose heads have parted company with their bodies. You will appreciate that it would be impossible otherwise for members to participate in hunt activities, such as horseback head juggling and head polo. It is with greatest regret, therefore, that I must inform you that you do not fulfill our requirements. With very best wishes, Sir Patrick de Lancey Podmore." Fuming, nearly headless Nick stuffed the letter away. "Half an inch of skin and sinew holding my neck on, Harry. Most people would think that's good and beheaded, but oh no, it's not enough for Sir properly decapitated Podmore." Nearly headless Nick took several deep breaths and then said, in a far calmer tone, "So what's bothering you?" "Anything I can do." Violet was about to ask if he'd heard any scary voices in his head lately, but was cut off by Harry saying, "No, not unless you know where I can get 7 free Nimbus 2000 and ones for our next match against Sly." The rest of Harry's sentence was drowned out by a high-pitched mewling from somewhere near their ankles. Violet looked down and found herself gazing into a pair of lamp-like yellow eyes. It was Mrs. Norris, the skeletal grey cat who was used by the caretaker, Mr. Filch, as a sort of deputy in his endless battle against students. "You better get out of here, you two," said Nick quickly. "Filch isn't in a good mood. He's got the flu, and some third years accidentally plastered frog brains all over the ceiling in Dungeon 5. He's been cleaning all morning, and if he sees you dripping mud all over the place—" "Right," said Harry, backing away from the accusing stare of Mrs. Norris, but not quickly enough. Drawn to the spot by the mysterious power that seemed to connect him and his foul cat, Mr. Filch burst suddenly through a tapestry to Violet's left, wheezing and looking wildly about for the rule breakers. There was a thick tartan scarf bound around his neck, and his nose was unusually purple. "Filth!" he shouted, his jowls a-quiver, his eyes popping alarmingly as he pointed at the muddy puddle that had dripped from Harry's Quidditch robes. "Mess and muck everywhere. I've had enough of it, I tell you." "Follow me, Potter." Violet hastily stepped out of Harry's way, only for Filch to snarl for her to follow as well. "Me," she protested, "but I'm clean." "You're an accomplice," Filch spat, "found at the scene of the crime." "Follow me now." So the twins waved a gloomy goodbye to nearly headless Nick and followed Filch back downstairs, doubling the number of muddy footprints Harry had left on the floor. Neither of them had ever been inside Filch's office before. It was a place most students avoided. The room was dingy and windowless, lit by a single oil lamp dangling from the low ceiling. A faint smell of fried fish lingered about the place. Wooden filing cabinets stood around the walls. From their labels, Violet could see that they contained details of ever pupil Filch had ever punished. Fred and George Weasley had an entire drawer to themselves. A highly polished selection of chains and manacles hung on the wall behind Filch's desk. It was common knowledge that he was always begging Dumbledore to let him suspect students by their ankles from the ceiling. Filch grabbed a quill from a pot on his desk and began shuffling around looking for parchment. "Dung," he muttered furiously. "Great sizzling dragon bogies, frog brains, rat intestines. I've had enough of it. Make ink sample. Where's the form? Yes." He retrieved a large roll of parchment from his desk drawer and stretched it out in front of him, dipping his long black quill into the ink pot. "We'll start with you, boy name. Harry Potter. Crime." "It was only a bit of mud," said Harry. "It's only a bit of mud to you, boy, but to me it's an extra hour scrubbing," shouted Filch, a drip shivering unpleasantly at the end of his bulbous nose. "Crime. Defouling the castle. Suggested sentence." Dabbing at his streaming nose, Filch squinted unpleasantly at Harry, who shrank back in his seat and waited for his sentence to fall. But as Filch lowered his quill, there was a great bang on the ceiling of the office, which made the oil lamp rattle. "Peeves!" Filch roared, flinging down the quill in a transport of rage. "I'll have you this time, I'll have you." And without a backward glance at the twins, Filch ran flat-footed from the office, Mrs. Norris streaking along beside him. Peeves was the school poltergeist, a grinning, airborne menace who lived to cause havoc and distress. Violet didn't much like Peeves, but couldn't help feeling grateful for his timing. Hopefully, whatever Peeves had done, and it sounded as though he'd wrecked something very big this time, would distract Filch from her and Harry. "Should we go?" Violet whispered, glancing toward the open door. "No way," Harry said. "It'll be worse if he comes back and we're not here." Violet grimaced, but knew that he was right. She sank into a moth-eaten chair next to the desk and resigned herself to wait. She was startled then, when right after warning her to stay out of trouble, Harry reached out and plucked something straight off of Filch's desk. "What are you doing?" she hissed, sitting up at once. "I'm just looking," said Harry, shushing her. "With luck, we'll never end up back in here. Might as well snoop." "You're terrible," Violet told him, but budged up to get a look at what he'd found. It was a large, glossy, purple envelope with silver lettering on the front, which read, "Quickspell a correspondence course in beginner's magic." Inside the envelope was a sheaf of fine parchment. More curly silver writing on the front page said, "Feel out of step in the world of modern magic. Find yourself making excuses not to perform simple spells. Ever been taunted for your woeful wand work? There is an answer. Quick Spell is an all-new, fail-safe, quick result, easy-learn course. Hundreds of witches and wizards have benefited from the Quick Spell method. Madam Z. Nettles of Topsham writes, I have no memory for incantations, and my potions were a family joke. Now, after a quick spell course, I am the center of attention at parties and friends beg for the recipe of my scintillation solution. Warlock DJ. Prad of Didsbury says, my wife used to sneer at my feeble charms, but 1 month your fabulous quick spell course, and I succeeded in turning her into a yak. Thank you, quick spell. Fascinated, Harry and Violet thumbed through the rest of the envelope's contents. Why on earth did Filch want a quick spell course? Did this mean he wasn't a proper wizard? The twins were just reading Lesson 1, Holding Your Wand, some useful tips, when shuffling footsteps outside told them Filch was coming back. Stuffing the parchment back into the envelope, Harry threw it back onto the desk just as the door opened. Filch was looking triumphant. That vanishing cabinet was extremely valuable, he was saying gleefully to Mrs. Norris. We'll have Peeves out this time, my sweet. His eyes fell on Violet, then on Harry, and then darted to the quick-spell envelope, which Violet realized too late was lying 2 feet away from where it had started. Filch's pasty face went brick red. Violet braced herself for a tidal wave of fury. Filch hobbled across to his desk, snatched up the envelope, and threw it into a drawer. Did you read? He sputtered. No, said Harry and Violet together, lying quickly. Filch's gnarly hands were twisting together. If I thought you'd read my private, not that it's mine for a friend, be that as it may, however, Violet was staring at him, alarmed. Filch had never looked madder. His eyes were popping, a tick was going in one of his pouchy cheeks, and the tartan scarf didn't help. Very well, go and don't breathe a word. Either of you not that, however, if you didn't read go now, I have to write up Peeves' report go, with a quick glance at one another. Amazed at their luck, Harry and Violet sped out of the office, up the corridor, and back upstairs. Violet really ought to have gone down to the slithering common room, but she was so preoccupied keeping up with Harry that it didn't even occur to her. Besides, to escape Filch's office without punishment was probably some kind of school record. Harry. Did it work? Nearly headless Nick came gliding out of a classroom. Behind him, Violet and Harry could see the wreckage of a large black and gold cabinet that appeared to have been dropped from a great height. I persuaded Peeves to crash it right over Filch's office, said Nick eagerly. Thought it might distract him. Was that you? Said Harry gratefully. Yeah, it worked. We didn't even get detention. Thanks, Nick. Thank you, Sir Nicholas, Violet said, causing nearly headless Nick's chest to puff out with glee. They set off up the corridor together. Nearly headless Nick, Violet noticed, was still holding Sir Patrick's rejection letter. I wish there was something we could do for you about the headless hunt, Harry said. Nearly headless Nick stopped in his tracks, and Violet walked right through him. She wished she hadn't. It was like stepping through an icy shower. But there is something you could do for me, said Nick excitedly. Harry, Violet, would I be asking too much? But no, you wouldn't want. What is it? Said Violet. Well, this Halloween will be my 500th death day, said nearly headless Nick, drawing himself up and looking dignified. Oh, said Violet, not sure whether she should look sorry or happy about this. Right. I'm holding a party down in one of the roomier dungeons. Friends will be coming from all over the country. It would such an honor if you would attend. Mr. Weasley and Miss Granger would be most welcome, too, of course, and any friends of yours would of course be welcome as well, Violet, but I dare say you'd rather go to the school feast. No, said Harry quickly. We'll come. We will. Violet said incredulously she'd rather been looking forward to the Halloween feast this year, and to tasting all the pies and pasties that Hagrid's magnificent pumpkins were sure to become a part of. But Harry was giving her a fiercely pointed look, so Violet cleared her throat and amended, Of course. We will of course come to your party, Sir Nicholas. Oh, my dears, the Potter twins at my death day party. And he hesitated, looking excited. Do you think you could possibly mention to Sir Patrick how very frightening and impressive you find me? Of course, said Harry. Nearly headless Nick beamed at them. A death day party, said Cassius keenly, when Violet had at last said goodbye to Harry and joined him and Tracy in the common room. I bet there aren't many living people who can say they've been to one of those. It'll be fascinating. Why would anyone want to celebrate the day they died? Said Tracy, who was halfway through her transfiguration homework and grumpy. It all sounds awfully depressing to me. The windows looking outward beneath the lake were practically black, with the occasional glimpse of something silvery gliding past in the distance. But inside, all looked bright and cheerful. The firelight glowed over the numerous high-backed chairs and low sofas, where people sat reading, talking, doing homework, or, in the case of Adrian Pusey and Graham Montague, trying to figure out what would happen if you fed a filibuster firework to a salamander. Pusey, a fourth-year and member of the Slytherin Quidditch team, had rescued the bright orange, fire-dwelling creature from a Care of Magical Creatures class, and it was now smoldering gently on a table surrounded by a knot of curious people. Violet was at the point of telling Tracy and Cassius about Filch and the Quickspell course when the salamander suddenly whizzed into the air, emitting loud sparks and bangs as it whirled wildly around the room. The sight of Gemma bellowing herself hoarse at Pusey and Montague, the spectacular display of tangerine stars showering from the salamander's mouth, and its escape into the fire with accompanying explosions, drove both Filch and the Quickspell envelope from Violet's mind. By the time Halloween arrived, Violet was resenting Harry's rash promise that they would attend the Death Day party. The rest of the school was happily anticipating their Halloween feat. The great hall had been decorated with the usual live bats. Hagrid's vast pumpkins had been carved into lanterns large enough for 3 men to sit in, and there were rumors that Dumbledore had booked a troupe of dancing skeletons for the entertainment. He's so stupid, Violet muttered angrily. Thinking of her brother as she tightened the stark black ribbon she decided to affix to the end of her plate. Why does he always have to drag me into it, too? At 7 o'clock, Violet, Cassius, and Tracy walked straight past the doorway to the packed great hall, which was glittering invitingly with gold plates and candles, and directed their steps instead toward the dungeons on the other side of the entrance hall. Harry and his friends were waiting by the staircase for them, everyone but Hermione looking as miserable as Violet felt. The passageway leading to nearly headless Nick's party had been lined with candles, too, though the effect was far from cheerful. These were long, thin, jet-black tapers, all burning bright blue, casting a dim, ghostly light even over their own living faces. The temperature dropped with every step they took. As Violet shivered and drew her robes tightly around herself, she heard what sounded like 1,000 fingernails scraping an enormous blackboard. "Is that supposed to be music?" Ron whispered. They turned a corner and saw nearly headless Nick standing at a doorway hung with black velvet drapes. "My dear friends," he said mournfully, "welcome, welcome. So pleased you could come." He swept off his plumed hat and bowed them inside. It was an incredible sight. The dungeon was full of hundreds of pearly-white, translucent people, mostly drifting around a crowded dance floor, waltzing to the dreadful, quavering sound of 30 musical saws, plays by an orchestra on a raised, black-draped platform. A chandelier overhead blazed midnight blue with 1,000 more black candles. Their breath rose in a mist before them. It was like stepping into a freezer. "Shall we have a look around?" Harry suggested. "Careful not to walk through anyone," Tracy said nervously, and they split into 2 groups and set off around the edge of the dance floor. They passed a group of gloomy nuns, a ragged man wearing chains, and the fat friar, the cheerful Hufflepuff ghost, who was talking to a knight with an arrow sticking out of his forehead. Violet wasn't surprised to see that the bloody Baron, the gaunt, staring Slytherin ghost covered in silver bloodstains, was being given a wide berth by the other ghosts. "This is brilliant," Cassius said in awe, turning in place to look at all of the shimmering specters around them. I've never seen so many ghosts in one place before. I didn't even know they could travel. Have you met many ghosts before? Violet asked. Well, not met, but I've seen them. There's an old castle near my family's home that's haunted. We used to go exploring there, me and my dad, before. Oh, look, food, said Tracy. On the other side of the dungeon was a long table, also covered in black velvet. They approached it eagerly, but next moment had stopped in their tracks, horrified. The smell was quite disgusting. Large, rotten fish were laid on handsome silver platters. Cakes, burned charcoal black, were heaped on salvers. I wonder what would happen if you put your ring on in here, Tracy whispered to Violet, hugging close to her arm for warmth. Do you think they'd know you weren't really a ghost? I don't want to risk it, said Violet, frowning, but it was a curious thought. When under the effects of her silver ring with its 3 milky white gemstones, her body became not only translucent, but also insubstantial. She could pass through walls and doors, and even other people, though it became very draining to stay inside of a solid object for too long. But she didn't float like a proper ghost. Her feet stayed on the floor, making no noise when she stepped, but surely she would stand out as an oddity amongst these properly dead spirits. Don't look now, Cassius said, leaning down to mutter to Violet, but it looks like your brother is having a chat with good old Peeves. Violet looked around in curiosity, finally finding Harry, Ron, and Hermione on the other side of the ballroom. They were indeed being harassed by the school poltergeist, a funny little man with a wide, grinning face and mischievous black eyes. But Violet was far more interested in the ghost that had floated over to them as well. She looked much smaller than the others, and it was with slight alarm that Violet realized she was wearing a set of Hogwarts student robes. Who is that? She asked, nodding in the direction of the ghost girl. Tracy groaned. That's Moaning Myrtle, she said quietly. She haunts the girls' lavatory on the 2nd floor. I made the mistake of going in there once. She's very nosy. And she's always screaming. They watched as Moaning Myrtle suddenly burst into tears and ran out of the dungeon through the far wall, Peeves chasing after her and cackling. Violet looked after her sadly. She looked so young. Suddenly the hall fell silent. The orchestra stopped playing. The crowd of ghosts became hushed, looking around in excitement as a loud hunting horn sounded. Through the dungeon wall burst a dozen ghost horses, each ridden by a headless horseman. The assembly clapped wildly. Violet looked quickly to Nick across the hall, saw the sour expression on his pearly face, and quietly lowered her hands. The horses galloped into the middle of the dance floor and halted, rearing and plunging. At the front of the pack was a large ghost who held his bearded head under his arm, from which position he was blowing the horn. The ghost leapt down, lifted his head high in the air so he could see over the crowd. Everyone laughed, and strode over to nearly headless Nick, squashing his head back down onto his neck. Let's head over, Cassius said excitedly, pushing between Tracy and Violet and winding his way through the translucent gathering. The girls had no choice but to follow or be left behind. They arrived in the midst of another gale of ghostly laughter. I think, Harry was saying as the 3 of them approached, Nick's very frightening and he looked desperately to Violet who, remembering her cue, went, oh, terribly frightening. Ha, yelled the head on the floor. Bet he asked you to say that. If I could have everyone's attention, it's time for my speech, said nearly headless Nick loudly, striding toward the podium and climbing into an icy blue spotlight. My late lamented lords, ladies, and gentlemen, it is my great sorrow. But nobody heard much more. Sir Patrick and the rest of the headless hunt had just started a game of head hockey, and the crowd were turning to watch. Nearly headless Nick tried vainly to recapture his audience, but gave up as Sir Patrick's head went sailing past him to loud cheers. Violet was very cold by now, not to mention hungry. Her stomach growled loudly, and she shot a glare at Harry. I can't stand much more of this, Ron muttered, his teeth chattering, as the orchestra ground back into action and the ghosts swept back onto the dance floor. Let's go, Violet agreed. They backed toward the door, nodding and beaming at anyone who looked at them. Cassius kept turning round for last, backward glances at the many guests, and a minute later were hurrying back up the passageway full of black candles. "Pudding might not be finished yet," said Tracy hopefully, leading the way toward the steps to the entrance hall. They were about halfway up the passage when Harry stumbled to a halt, clutched at the stone wall for support, and looked wildly around him. "Harry, what ray you?" It's that voice again. Shut up a minute. The rest of them stood there, silence and staring nervously at each other as Harry concentrated. He looked up suddenly, toward the dark ceiling above, and then began to run. "This way," he shouted, sprinting up the stairs into the entrance hall. The babble of talk from the Halloween feast was echoing out of the great hall. "Stay here," Violet told Tracy and Cassius, pushing them in the direction of the hall. Get some food if there's any left." "I'll be back." Harry rushed up the marble staircase to the first floor, Ron and Hermione and Violet clattering behind him. And behind her, she heard the stubborn footsteps of Cassius and Tracy as well. "Harry," said Ron, panting, "what ray we shh?" There was nothing they could do but watch Harry spin in place, looking around wildly, listening to something that nobody else could hear. His face blanched. "It's going to kill someone," he shouted suddenly, and run up the next flight of steps 3 at a time, hurtling around the whole of the second floor, not stopping until they turned a corner into the last, deserted passage. "Harry, what was all that about?" said Hermione, wiping sweat off her brow. "I couldn't hear anything." But Tracy gave a sudden gasp, pointing down the corridor. "Look!" Something was shining on the wall ahead. They approached slowly, squinting through the darkness. Foot-high words had been daubed on the all between 2 windows, shimmering in the light cast by the flaming torches. "The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the air, beware." "What's that thing hanging underneath?" said Ron, a slight quiver in his voice. As they edged nearer, Violet almost slipped. There was a large puddle of water on the floor. Harry and Cassius grabbed her, and they inched toward the message, eyes fixed on the dark shadow beneath it. All of them realized what it was at once and leapt backward with a splash. Mrs. Norris, the caretaker's cat, was hanging by her tail from the torch bracket. She was stiff as a board, her eyes wide and starting. For a few seconds they didn't move. Then Cassius said, "Let's get out of here." "Shouldn't we try and help?" Hermione said nervously. "Trust me," said Cassius, his face pale and his mouth thin. "We don't want to be found here." But it was too late. A rumble, as though of distant thunder, told them that the feast had just ended. From either end of the corridor where they stood came the sound of hundreds of feet climbing the stairs, and the loud, happy talk of well-fed people. Next moment, students were crashing into the passage from both ends. The chatter, the bustle, the noise died suddenly as the people in front spotted the hanging cat. The 6 of them stood, frozen, in the middle of the corridor, as silence fell among the mass of students pressing forward to see the grisly sight. Then someone shouted through the quiet, "Enemies of the air, beware. You'll be next, mudbloods." It was Draco Malfoy. He had pushed to the front of the crowd, his cold eyes alive, his usually bloodless face flushed, as he grinned at the sight of the hanging, immobile cat. Chapter 9. The Writing on the Wall. "What's going on here? What's going on?" Attracted no doubt by Malfoy's shout, Mr. Filch came shouldering his way through the crowd. Then he saw Mrs. Norris and fell back, clutching his face in horror. My cat! My cat! What's happened to Mrs. Norris?" he shrieked. And his popping eyes fell on Harry. "You!" he screeched. You've murdered my cat. You've killed her. I'll kill you. I'll Argus." Dumbledore had arrived on the scene, followed by a number of other teachers. In seconds, he had swept past Harry, Violet, and the others and detached Mrs. Norris from the torch bracket. "Come with me, Argus," he said to Filch. "You too, Mr. and Miss Potter and the rest." Lockhart stepped forward eagerly. "My office is nearest. Headmaster just upstairs. Please feel free." "Thank you, Gilderoy," said Dumbledore. The silent crowd parted to let them pass. Lockhart, looking excited and important, hurried after Dumbledore. So did Professors McGonagall and Snape. As they entered Lockhart's darkened office, there was a flurry of movement across the walls. Violet saw several of the Lockharts in the pictures dodging out of sight, their hair in rollers. The real Lockhart lit the candles on his desk and stood back. Dumbledore laid Mrs. Norris on the polished surface and began to examine her. Harry and Violet exchanged tense looks with each other and their friends, sinking backward outside the pool of candlelight, watching. The tip of Dumbledore's long, crooked nose was barely an inch from Mrs. Norris' fur. He was looking at her closely through his half-moon spectacles, his long fingers gently prodding and poking. Professor McGonagall was bent almost as close, her eyes narrowed. Snape loomed behind them, half in shadow, wearing an inscrutable expression. He looked to Violet as though he were puzzling over something. It was definitely a curse that killed her, probably the transmogrifian torture I've seen it used many times, so unlucky I wasn't there. I know the very counter-curse that would have saved her. Lockhart's comments were punctuated by Filch's dry, racking sobs. He was slumped in a chair by the desk, unable to look at Mrs. Norris, his face in his hands. Much as she detested Filch, Violet couldn't help but feel terribly sorry him. She thought of Crookshanks, likely curled up asleep and waiting for her back in the dormitory, and her heart ached. Dumbledore was now muttering strange words under his breath and tapping Mrs. Norris with his wand, but nothing happened. She continued to look as though she had been recently stuffed. "I remember something very similar happening in Ouagadougou," said Lockhart. "A series of attacks, the full stories in my autobiography. I was able to provide the townsfolk with various amulets, which cleared the matter up at once." The photographs of Lockhart on the walls were all nodding in agreement as he talked. One of them had forgotten to remove his hairnet. At last, Dumbledore straightened up. "She's not dead, Argus," he said softly. Lockhart stopped abruptly in the middle of counting the number of murders he had prevented. "Not dead," choked Filch, looking through his fingers at Mrs. Norris. "But why's she all still and frozen?" "She has been petrified," said Dumbledore. "Ah, I thought so," said Lockhart. "But how, I cannot say. Ask them," shrieked Filch, turning his blotched and tear-stained face to the twins. "No second year could have done this," said Dumbledore firmly. "It would take dark magic of the most advanced. They did it. Filch spat, his pouchy face purpling. "You saw what they wrote on the wall. They found in my office they know I'm a Filch's face worked horribly. "They know I'm a squib," he finished. "We never touch Idmas." "Norris," Harry said loudly, though Violet only shrank back further into the shadows, uncomfortably aware of everyone looking at them, including all the Lockharts on the walls. "And I don't even know what a squib is." "Rubbish," snarled Filch. "They saw my quickspell letter." "If I might speak, headmaster," said Snape from the shadows, and Violet's eyes went wide. "The Potters and their friends may have simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time," he said, glancing sidelong at the pair of them. "But we do have a set of suspicious circumstances here. Why were they in the upstairs corridor at all? Why weren't they at the Halloween feast?" Harry, Cassius, and Hermione all launched in an explanation about the Death Day party. "There were hundreds of ghosts. They'll tell you we were there. But why not join the feast afterward?" said Snape, his black eyes glittering in the candlelight. "Why go up to that corridor?" All of them looked at Harry. Because, Harry said, and Violet desperately hoped he was planning to tell Professor Dumbledore about the cruel, bodiless voice no one but he could hear. Instead, he came up with, "Because we were tired and wanted to go to bed." "And what about my students?" Snape asked, his gaze focusing on Violet, Tracy, and Cassius, who all immediately found other places to look. "Last I was aware, the Slytherin common room is down in the dungeons, not up the stairs." "Violet just wanted to say good night," Harry blurted, before Violet could even open her mouth. "We're very close." "Is that so?" Snape said softly. His eyes were boring into Violet. "Miss Potter, would you care to offer your own explanation?" I was following Harry," she said quietly, trying very hard not to meet Snape's piercing gaze. Because Violet risked a glance at Harry Shuntetto tell the truth. If there was something wrong, then surely Professor Dumbledore or McGonagall would be able to help him, or at the very least find the source of the voice. But Harry was staring straight at her as well. He gave a small, desperate shake of his head. "Because I wanted a hug before bed," Violet mumbled and looked at the floor. She heard Snape sigh. "So you were all going to bed," he said crisply, and Violet knew he didn't believe that for a moment, without any supper. "I didn't think ghosts provided food fit for living people at their parties." "We weren't hungry," said Ron loudly, as his stomach gave a huge rumble. Violet closed her eyes entirely, so she didn't have to see the looks on any of the professors' faces. At this rate, they were all going to be expelled for blatant lying. "I suggest, Headmaster," said Snape's voice, "that neither Potter is being entirely truthful. It might be a good idea if they were deprived of certain privileges until they are ready to tell us the whole story. Miss Potter is known to frequent the library. I believe a ban should suffice." It really didn't take much to make Violet start crying, and normally this punishment would exactly the sort of this to do it, only she was far too shocked. "As for Mr. Potter," Snape continued, turning a nasty smirk toward Harry, "I personally feel he should be taken off the Gryffindor Quidditch team until he is ready to be honest." "Really, Severus," said Professor McGonagall sharply, "I see no reason Toad Preveth's children of anything. This cat wasn't hit over the head with a book of a broomstick. There is no evidence at all that the Potters have done anything wrong." Dumbledore was giving Harry a searching look. "Innocent until proven guilty, Severus," he said firmly. Snape looked furious. So did Filch. "My cat has been petrified," he shrieked, his eyes popping. "I want to see some punishment." "We will be able to cure her, Argus," said Dumbledore patiently. "Professor Sprout recently managed to procure some mandrakes. As soon as they have reached their full size, I will have a potion made that will revive Mrs. Norris." "I'll make it," Lockhart buted in. "I must have done it 100 times. I could whip up a mandrake restorative draught in my sleep." "Excuse me," said Professor Snape icily, "but I believe I am the potions master at this school." There was a very awkward pause. "You may go," Dumbledore said to the group of them. "I will escort my students," Snape said sharply, "to ensure that they successfully find their way without detour." Violet, Tracy, and Cassius all shared nervous looks. However, as none of the other teachers protested, they had no choice but to follow after Professor Snape as he billowed out of Lockhart's office. The three of them walked in silence down the stairs, trying to keep up with the brisk pace set by Professor Snape. The second-floor corridor was still a horror to behold. While the water had been cleaned from the floor, the horrible message still glistened on the stone wall. Violet kept her eyes down. She couldn't bear to look at it again. Snape led them all the way down the marble steps, through the entrance hall, and down into the Slytherin dungeons. "Lex Talionis," Professor Snape said, and the concealed doorway into their house, common room appeared and silently swung open. Cassius ducked quickly inside, followed by Tracy, but when Violet tried to pass through the door, she was stopped by a black-clad arm blocking her path. "Hold a moment, Potter," said Professor Snape. "Let's have a word." Violet stepped away from the door, which shut silently behind her. To her, it felt like the ceiling of a tomb. Professor Snape was looking down at her with such intensity that Violet was sure he could see right through her into the corridor behind, as surely as if she was hidden beneath Harry's invisibility cloak. "Is there anything you would like to tell me, Miss Potter?" Snape said softly, and it was the softness that told Violet she was really in trouble. She'd heard him use that tone before tearing a student apart in class, and had no desire whatsoever for that level of ire to be turned on her. But now, alone in the empty corridor with nowhere to run, it seemed she had little choice but to bear the brunt on her own. Professor Snape took a deep breath as Violet shook her head. "I notice that your brother has a measure of influence over you," he said slowly. "Upstairs it was clear to me that you wanted to speak up, yet a single look from him silenced you. I understand such loyalty and acknowledge that it has its place. However, this is a very serious situation, Potter. And whatever it is you are holding back, However insignificant you may think it is, I would be very interested to hear it." Violet blinked rapidly as she stared down at Professor Snape's shoes, determined not to let him see her crying again. It had become something of a joke amongst her classmates, started of course by Draco Malfoy, that all it took to make Potter start crying was a stiff breeze in her direction. Harry had never made her feel badly for crying, but if it was a sign of weakness or a trait worthy of ridicule, then Violet was determined to stamp it out at all costs. "We really were at the Death Day party," she started, her voice very small and watery. "But it was cold, and we were hungry, so we left. And then Harry—" Violet bit the inside of her cheek. The look Harry had shot her in Lockhart's office flashed through her mind, the pleading in his eyes for her to keep her mouth shut. "He what?" Snape asked, inclining his head to look more closely at her. Again, Violet averted her gaze. She didn't like the way his eyes looked in the torchlight, black and hollow. "He said he heard a voice talking about killing somebody," Violet said in a rush, before she could stop herself. "He heard it before during detention with Lockhart, and then he heard it again tonight, leaving the ghost party." "What exactly did this voice say, Miss Potter?" Snape said, his voice much sharper than it had been before. Tears were sliding freely down her cheeks now. He said it wanted to rip and tear and to let it kill him." "Did he hear this voice?" "No, sir." "Did anyone else hear this voice, Mr. Weasley or Miss Granger?" "No, sir." Snape was quiet for a long moment. Violet could hear her own heartbeat hammering in her chest. "Do you believe your brother was truly hearing something the rest of you could not?" Professor Snape said, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Or could he have been lying?" "No," said Violet at once, jerking her head and causing teardrops to drip from her chin. "No, we don't." She took a deep breath and let it come out, slow and shaky. "Harry doesn't lie to me, sir." In that long stretch of time, as Snape pondered what she had told him and Violet processed everything that had just come out of her mouth, a terrible fear wrapped its icy fingers around her rabbit heart and began to squeeze it tightly. Harry would be so angry with her. She had betrayed his trust, and he would be hurt and upset and would maybe never trust her again. And if she'd said too much or let on that something was wrong with Harry, then it would be her fault if they took him away or made him leave. If Harry was crazy, which he wasn't, Violet didn't believe that for a moment, and she was the one who got him in trouble, then she would never be able to live with herself. She would have to tell him she was sorry, that she'd only done it because she'd thought it was for the best. That is, if Harry would even speak to her again. "Thank you, Miss Potter," said Professor Snape from right in front her, and Violet flinched as she was pulled from her thoughts. "Your honesty is appreciated. It would have been more appreciated had you come forward when first pressed, however." Violet opened her mouth to say sorry, but no sound came out, only a tight, strangled breath that caught in the back of her throat. "Go to bed, Potter," Professor Snape said, not unkindly, finally removing his arm from in front of the doorway. "I'm tired of catching you in corridors that you have no place being. See that it doesn't happen again. Lex talionis." As the common room door slid open, Violet let out a small squeak and darted inside. Cassius and Tracy were waiting near the door and came at once to ask her what had happened, but Violet pushed straight past them and headed for her dormitory. "Enemies of the air, beware," called Malfoy's voice from in front of the fire, followed by a chorus of ugly laughter. Violet was sobbing before she even got the door closed. The next morning, Violet expected to see no sign of Harry. She thought surely he would have been dragged off in the night, locked away in the infirmary while they asked him questions, and ran tests, and poked and prodded, and did all sorts of horrible things to find out if her were crazy or not. But there he was, sitting at the Gryffindor table next to Ron and Hermione, hunched over a bowl of porridge. He didn't look any worse for where he was smiling and talking to his friends and housemates. He wasn't hurt. He wasn't acting strange. Violet kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, a professor to walk up and make Harry follow them away, or a letter to arrive and land in his lap. But there was nothing. Just Harry, safe and sound. For a few days, the school could talk of little else but the attack on Mrs. Norris. Filch kept it fresh in everyone's mind by pacing the spot where she had been attacked, as though he thought the attacker might come back. Violet had seen him scrubbing the message on the wall with Mrs. Scour's all-purpose magical mess remover, but to no effect. The words still gleamed as brightly as ever on the stone. When Filch wasn't guarding the scene of the crime, he was skulking red-eyed through the corridors, lunging out at unsuspecting students, and trying to put them in detention for things like breathing loudly and looking happy. Ginny Weasley seemed very disturbed by Mrs. Norris' fate. According to Ron, she was a great cat lover. Violet had only seen her from a distance, however, walking between classes, white-faced and nervous-looking. Violet wanted to speak to her, to ask Ginny if she was all right, but there never seemed to be a moment of quiet for them to connect. Ginny was a first Uranda Gryffindor, which meant they shared no classes and were rarely in the same place at the same time. For the same reasons, it was getting harder to spend time with Cassius as well. He had few friends in his own year, and his elective courses, care of magical creatures and divination, were keeping him busier than they had last year. When they did have free time to spend together, it was during meals in the Great Hall and evenings in the Slytherin Common Room, both of which were hardly private places that weren't fit to discuss what Violet had in mind. "Come on," Violet muttered to Tracy during lunch, stuffing a wrapped buttered roll into her pocket for later. Tracy, whose mouth was full of mashed potato, looked up at her in confusion. "What are we doing?" "I want to talk to Moaning Myrtle," said Violet. Tracy immediately groaned. "Violet, please, she's really miserable." "I know, that's why I want to talk to her. Are you coming or not?" With a great roll of her eyes, Tracy dramatically pushed half-full plate of food away from her and followed Violet out of the great hall, dragging her feet pointedly behind her. In the doorway, they were lucky enough to run into Cassius, who was just coming in from the grounds with grass stains on his robes. "Oh, hi," he said in surprise. "You didn't have to wait for me, but we're heading out," Violet said, and his face went pink. "Come with, I want to talk to a ghost." "But I'm hungry," Cassius whined. Violet shoved the buttered roll into his hands and grabbed his elbow, pulling him along behind her. From Tracy, Violet knew that Moaning Myrtle liked to haunt the girls' bathroom on the second floor, though she could often be found in other toilets as well. She didn't like the thought of going back near the second-floor corridor, but she would feel better about it with her friends. It was either go now, all together, or Violet would have to sneak out at night by herself. And while she'd been trying to be more brave, with some coaching from a bemused Gemma Farley, Violet didn't quite feel up to talking to a ghost by herself in the middle of the night. "I'll keep watch," said Cassius as they approached the doors. "Why?" said Violet. "We're allowed to be here, aren't we?" "You're allowed to be here," he said, nodding at the sign on the door. "You're eggles. The last thing I need is to be caught coming out of the girls' loo with you too." "What's wrong with us two?" said Tracy indignantly. Cassius just crossed his arms and leaned stubbornly against the wall. Violet, time-conscious as she was, pushed right past him and stepped inside. She'd never used this bathroom before. There was one in the dungeons and one on the third floor as well, both of which were more convenient than coming here. It was just as well, really. It was the gloomiest, most depressing bathroom Violet had ever set foot in. Under a large, cracked and spotted mirror were a row of chipped sinks. The floor was damp and reflected the dull light given off by the stubs of a few candles, burning low in their holders. The wooden doors to the stalls were flaking and scratched, and one of them was dangling off its hinges. Faintly, the sound of crying could be heard. "Hello," Violet called, taking another few steps into the room. Tracy followed nervously behind, shutting the door quietly behind them. "Hello, I'm looking for Moaning Myrtle," the crying cut off in a sharp sob. Violet jumped as the stall door nearest her slammed open, and there, hovering above the back of the toilet, with arms crossed over her chest, was the short, transparent form of the dead girl Violet had seen at the Death Day party. She was no longer weeping. In fact, she looked furious. "Moaning Myrtle," the girl said, floating slowly toward her. "Miserable Myrtle, Maybe she's better off dead, Myrtle. Is that who you're looking for? And who are you supposed to be anyways? Sorry, Violet stammered, taking a quick step backward. I didn't know what else to call you. Oh, moaning Myrtle is fine, she said, her tone suddenly brighter. It's what everybody calls me, you know. When they even bother to speak to me. She burst into tears again, then turned and dove through the wooden wall and into the next stall. I tried to warn you, Tracy muttered, but Violet was determined. She was missing out on a meal to try and have this conversation, and by Merlin she was going to have it. Screwing up her courage, Violet walked over to the next stall and yanked the door open herself. "Excuse me," she said to the ghost, who was now upside down and crying into the toilet, "but I'd like to ask you some questions, if you don't mind. My name is Violet Potter. I saw you at the Death Day party, and why were you at that horrible party?" Myrtle interrupted. "You're it dead. Sir Nicholas invited us," said Violet mildly. Moaning Myrtle glared suspiciously at her, slowly rotating in the air until she was right side up. "What did you say your name was?" "Potter." Violet Potter. Do you know her, Potter?" He's my brother, so I suppose I know him." Myrtle laughed suddenly, girlish and cheeky. The tears were gone. "He's very handsome," she said coyly. "Oh," Violet said, taken aback. "He is," Myrtle nodded. Violet thought her translucent cheeks might have a bit more pigment to them. "He came to visit me here, too," said moaning Myrtle, "with another boy and that nosy Granger girl. I've never had so many visitors before. Usually when people come looking for me, all they want to do is tease me and call me names." And then Myrtle's lower lip began to tremble, and Violet feared she might start sobbing again. "Harry doesn't usually talk to other girls," Violet said quickly, hoping to distract the ghost from her misery. "What did he come to see you about?" "Oh, he had all sorts of boring questions," said Myrtle. She drifted backward and down until she appeared to be sitting on the back of the toilet. "They wanted to know about something that happened outside in the hall after Peeves chased me away from the party. Something to do with a cat." "Did you see anything?" Tracy said, speaking for the first time. Myrtle scrunched up her nose. "I already told them. No, I wasn't paying attention. Peeves upset me so much I came in here and tried tackle myself. Then, of course, I remembered that I'm." She was looking dangerously teary again. "How did you die, Myrtle?" Violet blurted suddenly, not knowing what else to possibly say to get her attention. And much to her amazement, it worked. Myrtle stopped crying at once. She looked at Violet in surprise, mouth hanging open as she floated in the cramped stall. "How did Iddy?" she repeated softly. "Nobody's ever wanted to talk to me about that before. Never." "But you were a student here when you died, weren't you?" Violet asked. "Didn't the teachers want to know what happened to you?" "Nobody cared what happened to me," Myrtle snapped suddenly. "It took them hours and hours to find my body. You know, I was right there, where she's standing." She pointed a silvery finger at Tracy, who looked down at her feet with wide eyes before leaping back several feet. "And then all they wanted to do was keep it quiet, pretend like everything was normal. Some men from the ministry came, but they didn't talk to me either. They probably all decided I'd killed myself, hoped that I'd killed myself." "But you didn't kill yourself," Violet pressed. She took another good look at Myrtle, searching for any signs of a wound, bruises, blood, stains, anything. But unlike the other ghosts who bore clear signs of their demise, Myrtle looked perfectly clean and healthy. "Of course I didn't," wailed moaning Myrtle dramatically. "He said he would, but I never planned to actually do it. I didn't want to give Olive Hornby the satisfaction of thinking she was the reason I died. But oh, she got that in the end. She was the one that drove me in here, with her bullying. It was her fault that I died, and I made sure she remembered that for the rest of her pathetic life." "But how did it happen?" Violet asked, desperately. "Who killed you, Myrtle?" Again, just as suddenly as she had before, Myrtle deflated and went silent. She stared, blinking slowly in Violet's direction, but no tether, as though she was looking through her body to her own reflection in the cracked mirror behind. "I don't know. You don't remember?" "No, I remember dying," she said, still looking very far away. I remember being alive one moment and then not, but I didn't see him. Him, Tracy said. How do you know it was a boy? I heard him talking, Myrtle said slowly. He said something funny, a different language it must have been. I was upset, and he wasn't meant to be in here, so I opened the door to tell him to go away and then I died. The bathroom was silent. Only the faint sound of dripping water and Violet and Tracy's breathing could be heard while Myrtle stared off into the distance. Pearly, translucent tears were streaming down her cheeks. Violet wanted to comfort her, wished that there was some way she could, but knew that if she were to reach out and pat Myrtle's shoulder, her hand would pass straight through. Unless you all right in there? Violet jumped almost a foot in the air as Cassius' voice rang out from the doorway, echoing loudly off the tiles. We're fine, go away, Violet yelled back. But lunch is nearly over, he said. Suddenly moaning Myrtle shot up from the toilet seat, zipping right through Violet and leaving her gasping with the sudden cold. A moment later Cassius let out a small, high-pitched scream. The girls turned quickly back to the entrance and found Myrtle's body sticking halfway through the door, her legs and bottom still in the bathroom, while her arms and face were out in the hall, shouting at Cassius. You're not allowed in here, she shrieked. Spying on us, awful nasty boy. Get out, get out, get out. Move, Violet hollered, shoving Cassius away from the door as moaning Myrtle began to cry and wail, dashing in and out of the door, screaming at them to leave. They ran and ran, through the second-floor corridor, down the marble staircase, and out into the entrance hall where all the other students were just starting to stream out now that lunch was over. Cassius was white-faced. The hem of Tracy's robes were damp, and Violet was shaking and out of breath, but they had gotten away from moaning Myrtle and her tantrum. And finally Violet had some answers to the questions that had troubled her for the past week. Chapter 10. The Rogue Bludger. Since talking with Myrtle, Violet had spent all possible free time in the library, searching for clues about what could have caused the girl's death. After some digging through old copies of Thedley Prophet'd been able to find an article about the death of a student many years earlier, in 1943, Myrtle Warren, aged 13. There was no picture, but Violet was certain there was only one person it could be. Only there wasn't a cause of death listed anywhere. Myrtle had made very clear that she waskelled, but the paper only reported that she haddied. No arrests were made in connection to the murder, or at least none that Violet had been able to find yet. Nor had she been able to get back into the girls' bathroom to talk to Myrtle again. After their conversation and Cassius' interruption, the ghost had apparently been so upset she opened all the taps and flooded the whole corridor again. Now, hanging on the door was a prominent notice reading, "Out of order, no entry." The one time that Violet had tried to sneak back and she was told off by Percy Weasley, who stepped out from the shadows and very formally warned her that if she proceeded, he would have to give her a detention. The morning after her talk with Myrtle, Violet had slipped over the Gryffindor table and tried to tell everything she'd found out to Harry, Ron, and Hermione. They had already been to see Myrtle themselves, and unfortunately only wanted to complain about how annoying they'd found the ghost girl. It was during this conversation that they shared a suspicion the three of them had been cultivation, and the very notion of it made Violet's stomach turn over. What if Draco Malfoy was the heir of Slytherin? It's possible, Harry muttered, keeping his voice low. His whole family's been in Slytherin, haven't they? They could easily be Slytherin's descendants. They could have had the key to the Chamber of Secrets for centuries, said Ron, handing it down, father to son, and you've heard the way he talks, Hermione said quietly. About blood purity and what it means to be a real wizard. Slytherin is all about that sort of thing. No, we're not, said Violet, frowning. Nobody ever talks about any of that except for Malfoy. There are plenty of half-bloods and muggle-borns in my house, too. Not that anyone really talks about it. It doesn't matter to anybody but people like Malfoy. Hermione looked slightly stunned. The thought of a muggle-born Slytherin had likely never occurred to her nor to Harry or Ron, who were exchanging skeptical glances. Violet was struck, and not for the first time, about how many prejudices and misconceptions her brother and his friends seemed to have about the house she'd been sorted into. After the last big fight with Harry, she'd thought the matter had been resolved, but maybe the issue ran deeper. Malfoy and his cronies certainly weren't helping anything. "Violet," Hermione said suddenly, her eyes brightening, "can I ask you a favor?" "Oh, I suppose," said Violet. "I don't know how much help I can be," but Hermione had whirled around and grabbed her bag from the floor, rummaging frantically until she produced a piece of parchment, which she thrust toward Violet. It looked to be a permission slip of some sort. What do you want me to do with this?" she asked. "I need you to get Snape to sign it," Hermione said, and Violet's eyebrows shot up. "Why don't you just have him sign it yourself? He likes you better than anyone in our year except for Malfoy, I suppose. If you ask him to sign it, he's guaranteed to say yes." Her tone was very matter-of-fact, as if this was all common knowledge. Worse, Ron and Harry were nodding along. It was Violet's turn to feel stunned. "I don't know about that," she said, recalling all the mortifying times Professor Snape had pulled her aside and given her a talking to, but the others seemed to have very different perspective on things. "You're at the top of his class," Harry pointed out. "Snape's always using your potions for examples of how terrible the rest of are," Ron said enthusiastically. "And remember the other day when he complimented your chopping with the bitterroot, and even told Malfoy he could learn a thing or two from you," said Hermione. Violet's face was feeling very hot. She did remember him saying that her slices were nice and even. But all of that was just because she was a good student. Violet worked hard and studied and turned her homework in on time. She followed Professor Snape's advice and the instructions he wrote on the blackboard. He didn't snap at her the way he did with Harry, but that's because Harry was, well, Harry and a Gryffindor to boot. Snape rarely took points from his own house if he didn't have to. But still, that didn't have anything to do with her. Harry, Ron, and Hermione were still looking at her expectantly, so Violet ducked her still blushing face behind the permission slip and tried to read it more closely. "Most potent potions," she read aloud. "Why is that familiar?" Violet narrowed her eyes at Hermione. "That's the book Snape was talking about last week. It's supposed to be full of all sorts of controversial potions and poisons. What do I want with it?" "Nothing," Hermione said, far too quickly. "I mean, it only sounded so interesting, and I, love reading. We want to brew a polyjuice potion," Harry bluntly, "so we can get into the Slytherin common room and make Malfoy confess to being the heir of Slytherin without him realizing it's us." Ron whacked Harry on the arm, and Hermione looked furious with him, but Violet was too busy trying not to laugh. "You're mad," she said, grinning at the three of them. "Do you really think you could do that, and that I would help you? Nobody from any other house has got into our common room for nearly 7 centuries. Harry, I'm not going to just let you waltz inside." "But this is important," Harry said earnestly. "We've got to talk to Malfoy and make him confess, and even he's not stupid enough to do that out in the open. It's got to be in the common room." "You're stupid," Violet said, smiling fondly at her outraged brother. "Harry, I'm in Slytherin, remember. I can go into the common room any time I want." She turned to Hermione, still grinning, though the other girl didn't look very happy at all. "And you're brilliant enough to come up with Polyjuice Potion off all things, but did you even think of just asking me to talk to Malfoy?" The look that Harry, Ron, and Hermione shared between each other said plainly that no, none of them had even considered such a thing. Ron's mouth was hanging open with the stunning realization, and Hermione looked as though she were mentally kicking herself. Violet couldn't stop laughing. "What was that all about?" Tracy asked as Violet sat down beside her at the Slytherin table. She told her and Cassius what Harry and his friends had planned, still smiling at the ridiculousness of it all. "All that, just to have a conversation with Malfoy," she exclaimed. "Honestly, if he really were the heir of Slytherin, don't you think we'd have heard him bragging about it by now? I mean, I suppose his whole family's been in Slytherin, but the heir, him, he's not," Cassius said suddenly. He was hunched over his plate of bacon, French toast, and scrambled eggs. The Malfoys aren't related to Slytherin at all. And as far as I know, there aren't any Slytherin heirs. The whole line died out ages ago. How do you know that? Violet asked, surprised. Cassius only shrugged. Pure blood families take their lineage seriously. We keep track of each other's families, too. For I dunno, breeding purposes. Your family is pure blood, Tracy asked, and he nodded. Yeah, I suppose. Not pure blood, you know, we're not sacred 28 or anything, but I think we're respectable by blood standards. Sacred 28, Violet asked. What's that? Cassius, who had just shoved a forkful of eggs into his mouth, grimaced. Essa list, he managed to get out. He took a few moments to chew aggressively and swallow his food. My dad told me about it. Some bloke made a list of all the wizarding families with the purest bloodlines. No muggles or squibs for ages and ages, I think. Malfoys are on it, but so are the Weasleys, if that tells you anything. But it only listed active bloodlines, and Slytherin wasn't on it. Why would your dad teach you about something like that? Tracy asked, her nose slightly scrunched. Again, Cassius shrugged. Guess it mattered to him, he said tersely. He didn't say more than that. Violet stared down at her plate, thinking, so there's no way Malfoy could be Slytherin's heir, she asked. Nope, said Cassius. So I don't have to go and talk to him, not unless you really want to. I do not. Cassius grinned at her, cheeks bulging slightly. Then don't. Problem solved. Harry wasn't pleased. When Violet passed the news on to him, she first had to convince him that Cassius was a trustworthy source of information to begin with, which was another frustrating trial. But at the end of the conversation, he'd agreed that the theory of the heir of Slytherin being Draco Malfoy was unlikely. Violet suspected he might have argued about it a bit more if he hadn't been so preoccupied by the upcoming Quidditch match. It was the first game of the season, Slytherin versus Gryffindor, and Marcus Flint had been absolutely insufferable. He was convinced that there was no way for them to lose with the new brooms from Malfoy's father, so convinced. In fact, that the Slytherin team had done very little training outside of flying around, getting used to the speed of the Nimbus 2001s. Whenever Violet was in earshot, Malfoy would brag loudly about his plan to leave Harry in his dust, something that she, unlike Harry, wasn't worried about at all. Professor McGonagall had seen Harry fly and seemed put him on the team immediately. Malfoy only got in after his father paid for it. As far as she was concerned, there wasn't a comparison. She joined the rest of the school on Saturday morning, marching down the Quidditch stadium. It was a muggy sort of day, with a hint of thunder in the air. Tracy and Cassius joined her in their usual seat in the stands, glancing anxiously at the sky, as if it were going to break open with rain at any moment. Violet cheered loudly as the two teams met in the middle of the field to shake hands, while the rest of her house cheered for their team. Her cheers were only for Harry. Madam Hooch's whistle sounded, and the 14 players shot up into the air. Harry, so much smaller than all the others, soared high above the rest and settled into his usual patrol over the game, searching for the snitch. It quickly became clear that the Slytherin's advantage for speed blurs of green and black sped across the pitch, making it almost impossible to tell who was who. But the Gryffindor team was holding their own so far, thanks in no small part, Violet suspected, to their team captain, Oliver Wood. A burly 6th year, Harry idolized him. He'd been training his team hard, and it showed. Violet let out another cheer as Harry artfully dodged a bludger that came pelting toward him. A moment later, one of the Weasley twins streaked past him after it and gave it a powerful whack toward one of the Slytherins. Violet's excitement turned to confusion, however, as the very same bludger seemed to change direction in midair and shot straight for Harry again. That's not supposed to happen, is it? She muttered to Cassius. What? I thought it was a good pass, he said, clearly not paying attention. His focus, along with most of the stands, was on the quaffle being tossed back and forth between the players. Slytherin was currently in possession. Violet turned her eyes back on Harry. It had started to rain. Harry was zipping wildly from one end of the field to another, shooting off at full speed and taking sharp turns in seemingly random directions. At first, Violet thought he'd already spotted the snitch, but a closer look, and she could see a black speck speeding along behind him, a bludger which should not have been able to make chase. "Something isn't right," Violet said. Both Weasley twins were practically flanking Harry now, blocking him as much as they were helping to beat the bludger away from his face. "Look," Tracy said, pointing to Wood. "They're calling a timeout." Violet stood on tiptoes to watch the Gryffindor team huddle together on the muddy grass. There was no chance at hearing anything from this distance, especially not with the whole crowd yelling and booing, but it was plain to see that Wood looked worried. Violet was certain they would stop the game to investigate the bludger, but when Madame Hooch reached them all, a nod was given, and they shot back into the air. This time the Weasleys stayed away from Harry. The bludger, however, did not. Violet clutched tight to Tracy's arm as they watched the rest of the game. Harry was higher than Violet had ever seen him fly before. He looped and swooped, spiraled, zigzagged, and rolled, even flying upside down to avoid another fierce dive from the bludger. There was laughter as more and more people started to notice Harry's bizarre behavior, but Violet's stomach was doing nearly as many flips as her brother. She watched as Malfoy drew up in the air near Harry, calling out to him. Harry hung in the air, staring at Malfoy. "Look out!" Violet screamed, too far to make any difference as the rogue bludger slammed into Harry's arm. She screamed again as he slid sideways on his broom, one knee crooked over it, his right arm dangling uselessly as he struggled to stay on. But instead of landing, Harry shot toward Malfoy. For a moment, Violet thought he meant to tackle him off of his broom. Sending them both careening to the ground, to their deaths, Violet let out a final scream as Harry let go of his broom with his remaining hand. Reaching out, his broom stayed level. As he gripped with only his legs, Violet's focus narrowed to that single wooden stick, hanging in the sky with her brother, attached to it with a soft, splattering thud. Harry hit the mud and rolled of HS broom. His right arm was hanging at a very strangle angle, his left raised into the air, and there, gleaming in his fist, was the golden snitch. And then he collapsed. Violet streaked down the stands, shoving students and staff out of her way without care as she made a beeline for Harry. "Move," she demanded, squeezing through the thick crowd of worried Gryffindors. "Let me see him move." Unfortunately, Violet was not the first to reach Harry. By the time she flung herself into the mud by his side, there was already another person kneeling over him. Dressed today in a pastel, seafoam green, Professor Lockhart was smiling down at Harry, wand at the ready. "Don't you touch him," Violet said viciously, putting a hand on Harry's chest to try and shield him from whatever Lockhart was about to do. Lockhart's smile faltered only briefly in the face of the sudden rage of a small girl. "Not to worry," he said confidently. "It's a simple charm. I've used it countless times. Why can't I go to the hospital, Wind?" said Harry through clenched teeth. "I'll take him," Violet volunteered immediately. "Wait, just let me." But Lockhart was twirling his wand, and a second later had directed it straight at Harry's arm. There was a dim yellow glow that spread from Harry's elbow, up to his shoulder, and down to his fingertips, and Violet watched in absolute horror as Harry's hole seemed to deflate. His wrist sagged in Lockhart's grasp, his hand flopping limply and without structure. The whole gathered crowd gasped as one, and little Colin Creevey began clicking away madly with his camera. "Ah," said Lockhart. "Yes, well, that can sometimes happen. But the point is, the bones are no longer broken. That's the thing to bear in mind. So, Harry, just toddle up to the hospital. Mr. Weasley, Miss Potter, would you escort him? And Madame Pomfrey will be able to tidy you up a bit." Harry, who had squeezed his eyes shut in alarm as Lockhart had began working on him, finally turned his head and looked down at his right side. His face immediately went paler than Violet had ever seen it. Lockhart hadn't mended Harry's bones. He had removed them. Madame Pomfrey wasn't at all pleased. "You should have come straight to me," she raged, holding the sad, limp remainder of what, half an hour before, had been a working arm. I can mend bones in a second, but growing them back, you will be able to, won't you? Said Harry desperately. I'll be able to, certainly, but it will be painful, said Madame Pomfrey grimly, throwing Harry a pair of pajamas. You'll have to stay the night. Ron and Hermione waited outside the curtain drawn around Harry's bed, while Violet helped him into his pajamas. It took a while to stuff the rubbery, boneless arm into a sleeve. How can you stick up for Lockhart now, Hermione, eh? They heard Ron say through the curtain as Violet pulled Harry's limp fingers through the cuff. If Harry had wanted deboning, he would have asked. Anyone can make a mistake, said Hermione. And it doesn't hurt any more, does it, Harry? No, said Harry, getting into bed. But it doesn't do anything else either. As he swung himself onto the bed, his arm flapped pointlessly. Even looking at it made Violet's stomach churn. Ron, Hermione, and Madame Pomfrey came around the curtain. Madame Pomfrey was holding a large bottle of something labelled Skelgrow. You're in for a rough night, she said, pouring out a steaming beakerful and handing it to Harry. Regrowing bones is a nasty business. So was taking Skelgrow, apparently. Harry coughed and sputtered as it went down as though it were burning his throat. Still tut-tutting about dangerous sports and inept teachers, Madame Pomfrey retreated, leaving Violet and Harry's friends to help him gulp down some water. We won, though, said Ron, a grin breaking across his face. That was some catch you made, Malfoy's face. He looked ready to kill. I want to know how he fixed that bludger, said Hermione darkly. It couldn't have been him, Violet said, frowning at the pair of them. I've already told you, he's got nothing to do with all this. You're standing up for him now, said Ron incredulously. First Snape, of all people, and now Malfoy, and I was right about Professor Snape, wasn't I? Snapped Violet. Malfoy's an arrogant prat, but he's not as clever as you lot keep giving him credit for. You didn't even talk to him, though, Harry said, sounding more than a tad reproachful. I know you trust Warrington, but he could be wrong, couldn't he? After all that stuff we heard about Slytherin back in the day, that's not exactly something you just tell anyone about, is it? Even for someone like Malfoy. So what makes you think he'd even talk to me? Violet said crossly. We're not friends, Harry. He hates me just as much as he hates you. Please, Harry begged. Look, if he doesn't confess, fine, I'll drop it. But at least Strito gets something out of him, Romans 6. For me, Violet glared at her brother, furious that he would even pull that card over something as silly as this. But the door of the hospital wing burst open at that moment, preventing her from calling him on it. Filthy and soaking wet, the rest of the Gryffindor team had arrived to see Harry. Unbelievable flying, Harry, said George. I've just seen Marcus Flint yelling at Malfoy, something about having the snitch on top of his head and not noticing. Malfoy didn't seem too happy. They had brought cakes, sweets, and bottles of pumpkin juice. They gathered around Harry's bed and were just getting started on what promised to be a good party when Madame Pomfrey came storming over, shouting, This boy needs rest. He's got 33 bones to regrow. Out, out. All of them were shooed from the hospital wing, Violet included, and Harry was left alone with nothing to distract him from the stabbing pains in his left arm. Hey, Violet said, jogging up between Fred and George as they shuffled away toward Gryffindor Tower. Thanks for looking out for him out there. I saw you trying to keep that bludger off him. You probably saved his life. Or you don't have to thank us, Fred said, wrapping a friendly around Violet's shoulder. We were only doing our job. Speak for yourself, said George, wrapping an arm around her other shoulder so that Violet was comfortably sandwiched between the pair of them. I like a bit of thanks now and again. So thank you, Violet, and you're welcome, for keeping you from going twinless for another day. Can't guarantee what Harry'll get himself into tomorrow, but for now you'll just have to keep on putting up with him. Violet couldn't help laughing. That was something she'd always been able to count on the Weasleys twins for. Since last year, whenever things were going tough, they were the ones who were able to get her to smile.